Emperor Wu of Han fought the Xiongnu his entire reign. He won battle after battle and still never solved the problem. The man who finally solved it was his great-grandson, an emperor who grew up in prison and never once led an army into the field. His method was neither war nor negotiation. It was something quieter. He made the Xiongnu slowly run out of reasons to keep standing. Where did this logic come from? That answer begins on the very first day of the Han dynasty. When Liu Bang founded the Han dynasty, his first crisis was not internal politics, it was the Xiongnu on the northern frontier. He personally led 320,000 men against them, only to find himself trapped on Baidang Mountain for 7 days and 7 nights, barely escaping with his life. For the next 70 years, Han took the path of Hecken, a policy of appeasement through tribute, sending silk, grain, gold, and imperial women northward each year in exchange for fragile quiet along the border. The fatal flaw in this logic was structural. The authority of the Xiongnu Kanyu, their supreme ruler, rested precisely on how much he could extract from Han. Every caravan of silk and silver that crossed the border told the entire steppe the same thing. That tribute worked. This was not peace. It was a standing extortion agreement that renewed itself on demand. Emperor Wu saw through it and chose direct confrontation instead. The Great Campaign at Mobe, deep in the northern steppe, shattered the Xiongnu military but left its political structure intact. The Xiongnu retreated northward and waited for Han to exhaust itself, which it did. By the time Emperor Xuan of Han came to the throne, Han was weakened, the Xiongnu were still there, and the standoff had been frozen in place for decades. The turning point came from someone no one had anticipated. Emperor Xuan, whose personal name was Liu Xun, was the grandson of a disgraced crown prince. After a palace purge destroyed his family, the newborn Liu Xun was thrown into a Xiong'an prison, where he spent his childhood. History records this almost as a footnote, but what that prison did to him ran far deeper than any palace education could have. A prison is not managed through direct violence. That is too inefficient, and it invites resistance. The real tools are subtler. Control the food, control the water, control what information reaches whom, set prisoner against prisoner through selective reward and punishment. Make every person feel that cooperation with those in power is the only path to survival. Liu Xun watched all of this from the time he could open his eyes. He saw how a person could be taken apart without a single blow being landed. Not defeated, but worn down, isolated, and finally left with nothing to hold on to. He saw how fragile alliances became under sustained resource pressure, how the calculus of loyalty could be quietly shifted until the people who stood together yesterday were informing on each other today. None of this came from books. It grew out of the daily reality of the world he was born into. By the time he sat on the throne, the targets had changed from prisoners to the tribes of the northern steppe, but the underlying logic was already second nature to him. The most durable form of power is not the blow that breaks an enemy, but the sustained pressure that prevents an enemy from ever consolidating. The strategy Emperor Xuan applied against the Xiongnu grew directly from that understanding. No decisive battles, no glory campaigns, only enough continuous pressure along the frontier to prevent the Xiongnu from rebuilding, combined with the steady erosion of their internal political structure. The operation ran on 2 parallel tracks. Economically, Han kept firm control over the border trading posts. Iron tools, grain, silk, things the Xiongnu tribes could not do without. Tribes that cooperated with Han gained access. Those that resisted were cut off. This lever worked more precisely and more durably than military strikes because it acted directly on the daily survival calculations of every tribal leader on the steppe. not just on their capacity to field warriors. Politically, Han granted titles and noble ranks to Xiongnu chieftains who submitted voluntarily, giving them a formal stake within the Han order. Over time, this cultivated a class of leaders whose interests were deeply tied to Han's continued favor. The longer this went on, the more centrifugal force it created within the Xiongnu Confederation. Those who aligned with Han prospered, those who resisted found themselves increasingly isolated. External pressure sustained, internal cohesion dissolving. The fracture lines kept widening, quietly, with no moments dramatic enough for historians to spend many words on. The fractures finally split open near the end of Emperor Xuan's reign. Civil war erupted among the Xiongnu, 5 claimants simultaneously contesting the position of Xiongnu, the steppe order collapsing into factional violence. Xiongnu, losing ground on multiple fronts, made a decision that stunned the entire grassland. He rode south voluntarily and presented himself at Chang'an to offer personal submission to the Han Emperor. It was the first time in Xiongnu history that its supreme ruler had walked in of his own accord and bowed. But the story did not end there. Xiongnu's most powerful rival, his elder brother, Xiongnu, watched Xiongnu's position rapidly strengthen with Han backing in food and military support, and found himself unable to compete. He fled westward, eventually establishing a base in Central Asia. The Han frontier commander Chen Tang then led an expeditionary force across that distance and had Zhiji killed, producing the phrase that has echoed through Chinese history ever since: "Those who dare to offend the mighty Han, however far, shall be brought to justice." With that, the other pole of the Xiongnu civil war was extinguished. The long border quiet that followed was not the product of a single act of submission. It was completed in 3 connected steps. Back Xiongnu, use him to isolate Zhiji, then eliminate Zhiji directly. The peace was designed, not waited for. This logic did not belong to Han alone. Across the world, other powers arrived at the same answer independently. In the 2nd century BCE, before Rome's final confrontation with Carthage, Rome did not move militarily at once. It backed Carthage's neighbor Numidia, tolerating and at times encouraging its repeated encroachments on Carthaginian territory. Carthage bled economically, its internal elite consensus fractured under sustained attrition. Only when Carthage had been reduced beyond the point of effective resistance did Rome declare war and finish what had already been decided. The military campaign was the last move. The real war had long since been won. The Byzantine Empire refined this approach into a sustained practice. Facing powerful nomadic confederations to the north and east, Byzantium almost never sought pitched battle. Instead, it used gold and titles to systematically divide enemy tribal alliances, elevated rival factions within those alliances, and used control of trade routes to economically strangle those who refused to cooperate. Historians sometimes call this Byzantine diplomacy, but its internal structure was functionally identical to what Emperor Xuan had built on the northern steppe centuries before. The Hekan policy fed the Xiongnu's appetite. Emperor Wu's campaigns broke the Xiongnu's spine. Emperor Xuan's patient erosion exhausted the last of their political cohesion. 3 generations, 3 strategies. Remove any one of them, and that moment of submission never arrives. The decisive blow in history is rarely what it appears to be. More often, there is someone unremarkable working a method that earns no applause, slowly removing every reason the other side had to keep standing. That happened 2,000 years ago. It has not stopped happening since.